With this, Dr. McIntyre, I would request you to start the session 5. Dr. Jack Shade, who's a professor of business a distinguished professor of business from Emory University. Dr. Shade, are you online, sir?
I'm online. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
sir. Great.
So I'll introduce you, but I think you really don't need an introduction. But Jag, it's a pleasure as a colleague to greet you and to thank you for really giving of your time to the event. Dr. Jag Stes is the Charles Kelstad Professor of Business, particularly in marketing. He's the recipient of the Padma Bhushan Award 2020. He's a fellow of numerous associations, all known to me: Academy of International Business, American Psychological Association, American Marketing Association. But most of all, is a Renaissance man, grounded in business management, marketing science, but who has vision and is able to see clear across the century. It's a gift that's not given to very many people. And it's against this background that we welcome his remarks today. And so, Jag, I turn it over to you. Welcome, and thank you for sharing your remarks with us.
Thank you, John, for such a nice introduction. And I do want to thank you and Ani for both organizing and hosting this great event. I think this US-India Business Summit is groundbreaking. Is able to show the future, and my topic is specifically more interesting in terms of the emerging US-India partnership for the next 75 years. Let me give a broad picture. The partnership has solidly begun more recently in the last 7 to 8 years, and it is likely to continue growing over time. And I'll show you the articulation or the way it's gonna go pretty much. So let me start by showing you my first slide. Let me see if I can get it done myself. And if so, I don't have to bother the host over there. Can you see the slide okay? Are you able to see my slides?
Please go ahead. It's perfect.
Okay, fine. Thank you. So the title is US-India Partnership the next 75 years. Let me show you the second slide. The timing is very key to understand. There was an old world order. As of 1987, 2 North American nations, US, Canada, 12 common European country nations, Western Europe, not the EU yet. Japan, as a late entrant after World War II, really controlled the world economy. And that drove also the politics and the military. 75% of GDP was generated by these 15 nations. 45% of all world trade was within these nations. And the reason why the trade is less is that most of these countries imported significant raw materials from their former colonies, like the British Commonwealth nations, for example, or French had their own colonies from where they would import agricultural or industrial resources. The key problem with all of them is they're all aging and aging very rapidly. And they don't know the solution about what to do with the aging population. Japan leads the world. There'll be fewer Japanese men next month than today. There's nothing they can do. German immigration is not enough. It is as many number of births as there are deaths, for example. We have a declining, increasing population despite immigration policy. So we are also in the same boat as most of the countries are for all advanced economies. And by the way, this is happening in South Korea now, etc., etc. World was stable. Balance of power between communism and capitalism was almost equal at that time. Cold War was a common front. Harmonious economic, military, and political relationships because US defeated Japan on the one hand, and the Allies defeated Germany on the other hand. So one could create a common architecture. Established 3 institutions: to come out with an international order, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and of course the United Nations. I think this created a stability, except the stability is now going away. So what has changed since that world order was established? The biggest event has been collapse of communism, and therefore the rise of independent nations, former Soviet Union, a bloc essentially by and large, Poland on the one hand, or Hungary on the other hand. Yugoslavia, of course, fell apart in the process. But it's very interesting to see how we have so many countries having their own independence, not a part of the bloc. Smartphones and social media have brought about an enormous transition or transformation of the society in general and politics in particular. Rapid aging of advanced nations, as I mentioned. We also established a new world trade regime because in the 90s, growth was not coming from domestic economies, and therefore one established liberalization of trade. Old tariff system was gone pretty much, and WTO was created, a World Trade Organization, as an arbitrator to make sure that we do liberal trade, bilateral free trade agreements, or multilateral trade agreements, or a groups to be formed, but it is managed very well. There's an arbitration mediation process, or a place where you can go and file your complaints. There was a now growing need for cybersecurity. All of this has brought about significant changes, and we have the new world order, or I call it a disorder. First of all, biggest dramatic change has been the rise of China, and China emerges as an economic superpower. And I'll show you some data in a moment. Enormous discord among our traditional allies and alliances. The harmony is not there as it used to be there. It was very well managed behind the scenes, but since the last administration in the US, things began to fall apart. There was even a debate whether NATO can survive by itself, except for the recent Ukraine war. And there are many other alliances worldwide which are uneasy whether they can continue or cannot continue. Populism everywhere. In fact, it's mind-boggling to see the elections where the incumbent party is defeated just because it is incumbent. People are very unhappy. What happened in Brazil, for example, what happened in Chile, what happened in Ecuador, what happened in Europe, it just goes on. Nobody would imagine the kind of changes taking place in France in terms of the elections. So incumbency actually is more like a curse rather than an advantage. And this is happening all over the world. Europe is leaning more toward the extreme right. Latin America, many countries are moving toward the left, essentially. Asia-centric economic and military pivot. The world is now looking at Asia as the future of the second half of this century, essentially. And things happening in Asia will happen and it will have an impact worldwide. Of course, the G20 conference taking place right now in Bali is a good indicator, and kind of behind the scene negotiations taking place clearly is talking about focus on Asia, both military as well as economic. It is going to become quite important. Rise of the new middle class in emerging markets. This is a very key phenomenon in consumer markets. More and more middle class wants branded products. Consumption right now is about 60% unbranded products, especially in emerging economies like India and Africa, and to some extent now China. But it is going to change all toward buying more and more branded products. The old distribution systems, which is unorganized retailing sector, is getting highly organized significantly by the e-commerce approach, for example. E-commerce is really creating an architecture of organized retailing. We also have a political and social acrimony globally, mostly created by social media, access to the masses and therefore followers, and one can create debates about everything in life. And capital markets are in turmoil. And I'll talk about primarily the rise of private equity shaping a lot of this US-India partnership relationships going forward. We need to watch the rise of private equity more so than the public equity or even the debt market. So what are the consequences? What we find is that the evolution of a new world order. Rather than Japan, it's being replaced by China. India emerges as another major trilateral power, and the United States on the other side. And this is driven by the rise of consumer markets as demand-driven things. India and China are the two largest consumer markets. In fact, these three nations probably accommodate 75% of all consumption in the world. It's that big. Infrastructure demand among all these three countries is very high. Chinese have already led in terms of investing in infrastructure. We are catching up in the United States, and India is about to invest massive amounts of money in terms of basic infrastructure, both physical as well as digital. We find significant need for defense. All three nations are arming themselves up. India is one of the largest defense weapon buyers in the world, and it's likely to align more its procurement toward the US and not just from French or the British or the Russians, for example. And security will become one more area. Security will drive both physical security as well as the digital or cyber security will drive the future relationships. So I have an institute that I'm founder called India China America Institute. I think the idea around here is that the play among these three nations will redefine the world, and we need to understand, hopefully the relationship between these three blocks will become harmonious. Unfortunately, it is not, because the legacy is very different. China has a communist legacy for almost 70 years, roughly. India has a mixed capital, basically. India does not trust capitalism to the level that we do in America. America is basically what I call a cowboy capitalism. So ideologically, the three are not convergent. They see the world from their lens in a very different way, from their own backgrounds and experiences. For the first time, you see US-China relationship becoming absolutely negative. I used to have a question mark or positive at one time, which was the case, but I think since the rise of the new leadership in China and change in our leadership, for example, the relationship is becoming far and far apart and almost becoming one of rivalry rather than a partnership. On the other hand, India relationship with United States, which used to be always a question mark, and now is becoming more positive. And therefore, what happens to the relationship between China and India will become very important understanding. So far, it looks like India and China also are distancing, which means you have India, United States as one counterbalancing force against China. India becomes now strategic in the new world order. And here is the reason. Look at the data. This is the estimated 22 numbers. I got it from Wikipedia, but it is ultimately attributed to the International Monetary Fund. I really like measuring GDP, not in the nominal sense, but using purchasing power parity. Given that we have floating exchange rates, the devaluation of rupee is so strong that it will be always calculated very differently if you measure in terms of the traditional measures. So purchasing power parity is a better measure than per capita income, for example. How much can you buy? Services are relatively affordable in countries like India, or to some extent even in China. Services are very expensive in America, especially medical services, educational services, or any way you look at it. So it tries to balance out the same market basket of goods. How do you balance it and come out with an index or an indicator and then calculate the GDP? So China is already $33 trillion. In regular GDP, it is still far behind America. US is 25 trillion in a PPP. India is about 11 trillion, and India is underestimated because it still has a significant, relative to other two nations, a large cash economy. People still prefer to buy and sell by cash transactions as opposed to credit cards, for example, or online payments, cell phones. It is coming along more and more, but it's still not there, which is a strange surprise that two of the top three nations are all former emerging economies. China is the middle income now. India is rising to become middle income. Now then you see followed by Japan, Germany, Russia, India, Indonesia, Brazil, UK, and France. The point I'm trying to make is that in this mix today, you see as many emerging economies as you see advanced economies among the top economies of the world. So what's going to happen? What I see as but 9 different potential areas of cooperation beginning very quickly between India and the United States. The first biggest one is going to be defense. And there are other defense partners will come in the way, such as, for example, defense partners come in the way, such as, for example, Israel. So defense is very key. Just hold on. Can you close it, please? Yeah. Close the door. I'm sorry, I'm doing it from my home and we have an interruption. The second biggest area is infrastructure, both physical and digital. These 2 nations have an enormous pent-up demand. India definitely needs that thing, and it will use not only just in fact the American side, but also Asia side. Japan is heavy investor, for example. South Korea may also invest. So infrastructure, physical and digital is second major area. Third one is modernization of agriculture. India's agriculture has to come to the modern age so that one can do value-add processed foods, for example, rather than just selling agricultural raw materials or industrial and agricultural raw materials. So modernization of agriculture is a big, big cooperative area because US is so advanced in agriculture, knows how to do large-scale farming, for example. And all of these are badly needed in India, and agriculture has to go from the bullock cart days to basically the tractor days as quickly as they can. Next area, of course, is cybersecurity and intelligence. This is a growing field between both nations. Both nations are under tremendous amount of pressure from the terrorism movements and in the security of the borders themselves, etc. So I think that's the second area. Now, however, more interesting for me personally is education. India is emerging as a major education hub for the world, especially for other nations. Both online education, India has changed its policy, the new education policy of 2020 will encourage foreign universities to establish campuses there, not just programs. And I think the movement has already begun. So the 2 nations will get together. US is very big in education, and I think education will become a common partnering area. In the previous session, I think there was a significant discussion about the role of training, HR, education. It goes on. In fact, I'm finishing a book, a handbook almost, on vocational education training, especially from worldwide, what we can learn and can be useful for policymakers, especially in India. Healthcare and public health would be another major area. And pharma is a very key industry. To me, pharma and medical devices will become a good partner place between the US and India. Next area is global warming. Sustainability is a key problem area. And again, the 2 nations will learn to cooperate significantly toward a common cause, mostly alternate energy. US is pretty serious about investing in alternate energy, giving incentives, so is India. I think there's a common partnering ground. Growth of bilateral trade. The trade will grow to at least $500 billion very quickly and has the potential to grow all the way to $1 trillion. Quite a significant part is to diversify from dependence on China as a sourcing destination. India is very capable of also providing huge number of industries where India can be the sourcing destination, along with Vietnam, for example, Cambodia, Asia in general, but India has a very large presence in terms of integrated manufacturing from end to end in garments, for example. Of course, India is very good sourcing destination for services industries, not just IT services, but now legal services, accounting services, entertainment industry, just goes on and on. So we think that the growth between 2 nations will rise enormously, and hopefully there'll be balanced growth in terms of as much exports into India as imports from India. Along with that one, surprisingly, there will be also a significant amount of equity investment. I'm a very strong advocate that trade and investment go together as a policy. So my estimate is running that about $100 billion of investment will be made. annually, where 60 billion or so will come into India from the US enterprises by and large. And I'll talk about the private equity in a moment. And on the other side, India will invest in America, especially in many of the industries where it is in the interest of America to basically exit those industries in terms of managing themselves. So in terms of ownership, for example. And the last area that I wanted to talk about is private equity capital. We have to understand private equity capital much more so. There's a rise of private capital in general worldwide. The largest capitalists today are all individuals, not sovereign funds. The amount of wealth by the top 100 or so people is mind-boggling, and it is growing at a faster rate than the S&P or any other indexes that you can take. And they will make the difference quite a lot. There will be the go-between, the partnership relationship between two nations, whether it is basically defense as an area, for example, infrastructure as an area, or just investing money to encourage more and more manufacturing in India and more, in fact, manufacturing in America. So watch the private equity would be my recommendation. I do want to mention there's a point I'm making at the bar due to legacy mindsets in both the US and the India. One of the biggest challenges we are facing is that the advisors to both governments or politically active individuals, well-known personalities, still have a legacy mindset going back to 1950, surprisingly. And this is a difference I find. Chinese are much younger advisors. And legacy, remembering old battles, remembering the non-alignment movement, remembering the contentious relationship in the past is going to come in the way because trust is still not there between US and India. And how do you build that trust on both sides is becoming more and more necessary. So the partnership will continue clearly on a long-term basis, but we'll have ups and downs depending upon who has what responsibilities in the two governments by and large. So let me quickly summarize and open up for questions and answers. I just wanted to mention the next chart, which I think is a fundamental change in India. So let me show that chart. India is going through a transformation of its own, mostly because of digital technology, the cell phone revolution, smartphones, whatever you would like to call. From a restricted domestic economy when it began its journey 75 years ago, it is now likely to become more and more integrated global economy. Not just linking to US, but the European Union, for example, and after Brexit, the British and the Commonwealth countries will get together in terms of their economic and hopefully public policies. But India is also on the move from low-tech to a high-tech economy. In fact, the wages are very much improved, very much by adopting technology, making the workers smarter. For example, automobile industry alone can tell you that today, all oil changes, a mechanic could do it or one could do it themselves is not possible. Automobiles are today basically computerized machines. Very complicated. You need a test instrument. Now you have to retrain the technician to become a smart technician, and the wages go up in the process. All movie making is giving way to digital media. So we need to learn skill sets about animation, for example, have to learn the skill set about special effects, etc. And those again command higher wages. So generally from low wage economy, it is likely to become more and more high wage economy, which is an evolution toward a low income country to the middle income country, as China has shown it can be done. So here is the conclusion. India is emerging as a strategic nation in the world order. Both China and America consider India as a very strategic for their future. China in terms of potential rivalry, competition in Asia, or influence in that part of the world. America, because America needs a partner, especially in the South China Sea, the Quad understanding right now, etc. It goes on deeper than what I'm suggesting here. I think it's going to happen. India has become more strategic to both sides of the equation. India is also very, very well wired with Russia, which is also emerging as a very key nation to understand its policy and where it's likely to go. Bilateral trade is likely to exceed $500 billion per year as the US looks for alternative sources to diversify from China. A lot will depend, however, on what happens in the world between now and the next decade with respect to geopolitics of the world. It has become more unpredictable about the future, especially with the Russian-Ukraine war that's taking place right now. Where does it go? Does it expand even further? Is it contained by diplomacy and policy? Is there some sort of a mediator that can emerge as it has happened in the previous wars? That I think is becoming very key. So I will stop here and see, John, if you have any questions for me. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Jag, for stimulating, eye-opening presentation, raising a lot of questions. I have one that's sort of in the middle in terms of level of analysis. India's rise and India's middle class really come out in part of the IT outsourcing in the 1990s and the first part of the 21st century with first generation cities, second generation cities, third tier cities, responding to global market needs for IT outsourcing. Can we expect to see more IT outsourcing in India as a source of revenue and as a further buttress for the middle class? Or can we expect that India will stand on her own in terms of having an autonomous, innovative IT industry, not so much dependent on outsourcing?
The Indian IT industry will make a major change. Neither sending work to India or bringing Indian workers to America is viable. The cost structure is not viable. At the same time, if you look at the largest number of applications for H-1B visas, it is coming from American multinationals. So companies like Microsoft, Google, all of the companies, Accenture, will have their own dedicated employment base in India. In other words, American multinationals in the IT services especially will become the largest employers in India, surpassing all the Indian IT services companies such as Wipro, Infosys, TCS, etc. Accenture is already leading the way right now. At one time, IBM was supposed to be the largest employer in India or the largest employer among the IBM. America was number one, followed by Japan, followed by India in terms of IBM employees. They were about to surpass Japan. They might have surpassed, but IBM has slowed down its growth, but it is now taken over by Accenture, for example. There are more employees by Accenture worldwide and a large share will go to. So the traditional outsourcing that is done will not happen. That's the main point. I think it will be the US multinationals who will have their own employment base as if like a large subsidiary doing the work, internal work.
Thank you. That is a major shift. We have little bit of time, like 1 minute, for a question from the audience. Anyone wants to have a go at it? Yes, sir. We probably need to get a mic to you. Let me bring it to you. So,
my name is Priya Misra. Excellent, excellent presentation. Very well researched. You seem to be an expert on a lot more than what you have led on. So I enjoyed it. Any economy, especially a democratic economy, needs a lot more than the vote. If you're going to progress, electricity is the lifeblood of any economy. You need water. You need good education. The Wall Street Journal this last weekend published a story about the H-1B visas.
Yes.
And there's a lot of dissension, it turns out, within political services, political circles, to allow more Indians or not allow. Something like 80% of the folks on the list are Indians. There's a huge demand, especially in Silicon Valley, for Indians who are qualified to come and work for them. How long would that trend continue? Based on what you said, maybe not long, Maybe the future is outsourcing directly in it. But
Yeah.
could you address the two critical areas, electricity and water? Because without those, we're not going to progress very much.
I think water is the biggest challenge, more so than electricity. Electricity, there is a very significant shift taking place in terms of alternate energy. And it seems like in India, what is going to be the largest alternate energy source will be the solar technology, not the wind technology, especially offshore wind, for example, as it is common in Europe. I also believe that India, for the first time, will now at least accept the idea that a nuclear power for electricity is a must. And this is where India will probably align with other nations who are absolutely more dominant in the nuclear energy production, such as France, for example, or as South Korea, for example. They have depended on nuclear energy for electricity, and that's a possibility. But nuclear energy takes many, many years to establish the plant and generate. Unfortunately, solar is much quicker. So India probably will end up, unfortunately, India's climate allows more installation of solar energy, as in the state of Gujarat, we have seen what has happened, for example, and will generate electricity enough to pump into the grid itself. So they become independent power producers, as we call it, IPP. So I'm betting more on the solar energy in India as an alternative energy. Natural gas, by the way, is very badly needed in India, which is a huge partnership because America is one of the largest natural gas producers in the world. In fact, Indian Gas Authority actually has, I think it's in Louisiana or someplace in South, their own infrastructure to carry natural gas on a boat around here, liquid natural gas, to come to India. So there's another energy, is another area where there will be cooperation.
Thank you, Jag. Thank you very much. We have reached the end of our allotted time, and the next presentation is awaiting online in session 6. So hearty thanks to you, and look forward to seeing you in person soon. Thank you so much for your question, sir. Also.
Thank you.